Good afternoon, everyone. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the Chamber and across the campus, so please take care to observe those measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. The next item of business is a statement by Kate Forbes on a response to the Chancellor's summer economic update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Kate Forbes for up to 20 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
And I welcome this opportunity. Initial response to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's economic update yesterday. And can I start by saying something positive, that I welcome elements of the Chancellor's statement. Last week I called for an £80 billion stimulus package from the UK Government to build a strong, green and inclusive economic recovery. That would be around 4% of GDP, matching the scale of Germany's plan and more in line with the Prime Minister's rhetoric of FDR. So while I support certain measures, not least the reduced VAT for tourism and hospitality, which I'd called for, much of the rest falls short of delivering what I believe is needed to boost the economy and protect jobs. For example, there's no extension to the furlough scheme for hard-hit sectors. There's no further support for households in financial difficulty, and still, now into July, just silence on the question of reasonable fiscal flexibilities for this government to respond appropriately to the pandemic. Indeed, many of the initiatives are short-lived, and rather than providing long-term certainty for businesses or households, they simply push the problems back towards the turn of the year, when we'll also have to contend with the end of the transition period with the EU. The Chancellor's jobs plan may have a headline value of up to £30 billion, but we should be clear that that figure is contingent on demand when some of the measures may prove to be poorly targeted. The figure also comprises the Prime Minister's investment package outlined last week, which we know extends to future years and does not add new money this year. I say all that merely to clarify the facts and the context, because I'm sure we can all agree that accuracy is important. Another fact is that the Chancellor's jobs plan itself generated only £21 million for the Scottish budget, a position confirmed today by the Fraser of Allender Institute. I appreciate that many of the measures are UK-wide, and the England-only spend is mostly recycled from existing budgets. But that disappointing figure is at odds with those being quoted by some parties yesterday. You cannot have both a UK-wide package and significant consequentials. Granted, there was further detail published yesterday separate to the jobs plan, albeit that was nearly all previously trailed measures, such as Monday's culture announcement and belatedly some of the long-promised funding for PPE. These and other previously known measures separate from the Chancellor's statement were reflected in a figure of £800 million consequential uplift that was also being quoted by some yesterday. And whilst that is welcome, it includes only £27 million that we were not already aware of beforehand. And I think it's helpful to be clear about what the various funding amounts relate to. For the record, the currently notified estimate of COVID-related consequentials for the 2020-21 Scottish budget is £4.6 billion, all resource except for £10 million of capital and financial transactions. And I would reiterate that that is welcome. But even with some simple analysis of the scale of the support needed, whether for businesses, communities or public services, it's clear that that is not enough to fund the recovery sufficiently and balance the budget. And that is why, together with devolved government counterparts, I continue to have constructive dialogue with the Treasury, and my expectation and my hope is that further information is yet to come on the consequential position, and I'll of course continue to keep Parliament updated. Presiding Officer, I should also stress that it is not just the funding amounts and lack of flexibilities that matter here. The timeline and the process are crucial too. It's intensely problematic for Scotland's recovery that, again, we have had to await the culmination of the UK government policy process and respond to announcements in this way, as our funding position is drip-fed to us, with limited engagement in advance on policies that interact so much with our devolved responsibilities. I was being fully transparent with Parliament in the debate on the 16th of June when I said that this year's resource budget was facing a shortfall of hundreds of millions of pounds. As time passes without the requisite certainty or flexibility from Treasury, we now face the possibility of having to take some critical decisions at fiscal risk. Again, I see this in the spirit of openness and working with the Parliament, as our collective efforts to budget more responsively and strategically are hampered without the prospect either of funding certainty or of any relaxations to the fiscal framework's limitations. I'll now turn from the fiscal position to specific measures. In advance of yesterday's update, I've been working since probably early spring to ensure that the UK Government was fully aware of our concerns and Scotland's needs. And last week, I published a report on the UK fiscal path which pressed the UK Government to avoid a return to austerity and adopt more flexible fiscal rules. Growing the economy and reducing inequality should take priority over deficit reduction until the economy has fully recovered. And as I alluded to earlier, the report called for a UK-wide fiscal stimulus package worth £80 billion. Such a package would generate funds to enable Scotland to shape its own response to the pandemic, as would temporary loosening of Scotland's fiscal flexibilities and provide a guarantee against negative Barnett consequentials being applied to the budget in the current financial year. I also wrote to the Chancellor on Saturday with some further specific points. We need a national debt plan that promotes fairness as well as economic recovery in response to the significant and widespread increase in debt as a result of COVID-19, which affects all parts of society. For households, that means working with lenders to ensure that loan, mortgage and rent holidays can be extended to those experiencing financial hardship. For businesses, it could mean scrapping interest charges or converting loans to equity managed by public policy banks such as the Scottish National Investment Bank. Young people have been particularly affected by the pandemic, and they are more likely to work in industries affected by closure and less likely to be able to work at home. I recommended a jobs guarantee for young people to ensure that they have access to work, an apprenticeship or training that helps prevent the damaging effects of being out of the labour market at the beginning of their working lives, building on the success of the Edinburgh Guarantee programme. To support consumer confidence, we recommended a temporary reduction in the standard rate of VAT to 15%, coupled with targeted additional measures for vulnerable areas such as hospitality and construction to support those businesses and boost consumer spending. That would help Scottish households and provide a stimulus to support business. The different devolved administrations share similar views on the general funding position and the need for fiscal flexibilities, and we've worked closely together to make a clear and consistent case to the UK Government now for weeks. I've also worked with parties across this chamber to build consensus on the principle of further fiscal flexibility as reflected in the Parliament's resolution on the 16th of June. Presiding Officer, to help set the context, I'll quickly recap on measures that we have already taken, not waiting for the Chancellor's statement. Colleagues will know that we've already committed a business support package worth over £2.3 billion, and that includes reliefs that will continue over the course of the coming year. We've already moved to implement the £230 million investment package announced last month to help stimulate Scotland's economy, creating jobs in construction, low-carbon initiatives, digitisation and business support by providing a pipeline of work for business. And we've also acted to support the oil and gas industry, which is a critical component of our economy and has a crucial role to play in the transition to net zero. Specifically, we established the £62 million Energy Transition Fund, which will support our energy sector and help us make significant progress as we move towards a net zero society. We also recognise the importance of boosting employability and acted in response. We've already confirmed an initial £33 million for employability in 2020-21, flexing and enhancing existing services to ensure that support is aligned to the challenges we face. And beyond our Communities Fund, we've committed a range of support, including £30 million to provide laptops for disadvantaged children and young people to study online. Now, the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery set out in its recommendations a Scottish job guarantee for young people. We've acted at speed to address that, and last Friday, Sandy Begbie was appointed to lead the implementation plan of that work and will report by the end of July. The recommendations set out the importance of industry leadership, Through our Developing the Young Workforce programme, we have a network of industry-led groups that are well positioned to support the implementation of any guarantee. We're clear that these jobs must be meaningful and must allow young people to develop skills that reflect the emerging opportunities. We must ensure that our young people are supported to make the best of the opportunities, and we're clear that the principles of fair work and payment of the real living wage is essential. Given much of the Chancellor's jobs plan content is new to us, I'm still assessing the detail together with Ministerial colleagues, but offer some initial thoughts here. The incentive payment for employers to bring back employees from furlough is welcome for those that it supports, but the benefit could vary depending on different businesses' prospects for a return to full operation, and that may risk the scheme missing its target level of support. On tax, I welcome the temporary cut in VAT for tourism and hospitality. That is something that we've argued for, not just for weeks, but indeed for years, and I'm pleased to see that the Chancellor has heeded those calls. But the statement missed the opportunity to cut taxes for employers. We argued that the stimulus package should finance a 2p cut in employers' national insurance contributions to reduce the cost to businesses of hiring staff, but the Chancellor has not taken action on that. Now turning to the Chancellor's announcement yesterday on stamp duty land tax. I've heard calls for me to replicate that change in Scotland under land and buildings transaction tax. We have a strong record on LBTT due to the reforms that we've previously taken. Our higher starting threshold of £145,000 in Scotland has meant that around half of all transactions paid no tax. We continue to focus support on first-time buyers and in assisting people as they progress through the property market. I've listened to calls for me to raise the starting threshold to LBTT to help stimulate housing market activity and the economy. It's important, though, that any change made in Scotland is focused directly on the particular needs of the Scottish economy. And so today, I can announce that I will increase the starting threshold for residential LBTT from 145,000 to 250,000. Because of the time required to prepare legislation and for Revenue Scotland to be ready to collect and manage the tax, the change will not come into force immediately. But I'll work to enable this to be introduced as soon as possible. The rates for the additional dwelling supplement and non-residential LBTT remain unchanged. That means that 8 out of 10 people purchasing a property in Scotland will be taken out of LBTT, excluding the additional dwelling supplement. And all home movers purchasing a property above £250,000 will be £2,100 better off. While changes to LBTT offer support to all those purchasing a home, this is a blanket measure and one which may not help first-time buyers. I'm also heeding the warning from the Institute of Fiscal Studies this morning that first-time buyers, and I quote, are a group that might actually be made worse off by the UK government's policy. I'm pleased, therefore, to also announce today further targeted support for those who may be most concerned about making such an investment at this time. The Scottish Government's first home fund was launched in December 2019. Even prior to COVID, it had been welcomed by stakeholders and take-up had been high. As a result of pent-up demand having been released following the end of stay-at-home measures and reflecting the more limited availability of higher loan-to-value mortgages in the market, demand for support is likely to outstrip current funding. I'm therefore providing an additional £50 million this financial year to directly support first-time buyers with their deposits, recycling underspend in the Scottish Government's financial transactions budget. That will support an estimated additional 2,000 first-time buyer purchases and lifts the total funding for this targeted measure to £200 million. By taking a distinctive approach in Scotland to raising the starting threshold under LBTT, I'm able to target further support elsewhere and to target it where the UK Government failed to provide funding to devolved administrations. The Chancellor's announcement of support for the economy and jobs yesterday resulted in just £21 million of consequentials for the Scottish Government. While clearly there are UK-wide schemes that will apply in Scotland, our assessment is that much more support is required for the labour market. That is why I'm committing today that we will make an additional £100 million available this year for targeted employment support and training to help keep people in work or help them retrain. Even alongside the Chancellor's Youth Employment Scheme, this is unlikely to be all that we will need to do to support employment and skills over the next year, but it is a first step, and the Economy Secretary will set out the policy details to Parliament soon. Beyond these initial actions, we'll consider the UK Government's announcements and their impact on Scotland more closely and respond more fully, and I welcome contributions on the detail from across the Chamber. Presiding Officer, I continue to seek to engage Parliament at every step of our fiscal response to COVID-19, reflecting the Government's route map and the evolving challenges for businesses, communities and public services. Following the summer budget revision, which set out more than £4 billion of spending to address COVID, I'll continue with the collaborative approach looking ahead to the autumn budget revision and, of course, the 2021-22 budget process. The Chancellor's economic update provided an opportunity for the UK Government to explain how it will support the Scottish economy, along with the rest of the UK economy, to recover from the impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. While the update showed that the UK Government is willing to act, we'll continue to press for action that better meets the needs of Scotland in the areas where this Parliament does not have the power to act. The Scottish Government's ambition is to work towards the elimination of COVID-19 in Scotland and for the Scottish economy to return to delivering prosperity and growth. In order to achieve that, I have set out to the UK Government the additional, focused, limited and temporary fiscal flexibilities that we seek, and we will continue to liaise constructively and in the hope that they will heed those calls. As I have said, under the current arrangements, our budgeting approach and timetable in response to this crisis continues to be heavily contingent on that of the UK Government. The fiscal powers we are seeking would enable the Scottish Government to respond to COVID-19 more effectively and reboot our economy. They are relatively limited powers. I'm still not quite sure why we're debating it, but they would ease some of the immense pressures on our budget and give us more tools to kickstart our recovery. It's also essential that the UK Government provides early clarity on its plans for the spending review and the budget this autumn to enable us to plan and contribute. Despite the Chancellor outlining measures worth up to £30 billion yesterday, most of it bypasses devolution and does not provide the Scottish Government with the funding that we need to enable us to tailor an economic response that meets Scotland's needs. Like all governments, we are facing huge spending pressures, but we don't have the tools that others have to meet them. And along with the governments of Wales and Northern Ireland, we have set out a reasonable, a proportionate set of new financial powers that would enable the Scottish Government to respond more effectively. This Parliament has voiced its support for that principle, and I dearly hope the UK Government will listen and will act.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement, and I'll allow around 40 minutes for that. It would be helpful if those members who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Donald Cameron.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of her statement? The truth is that yesterday Rishi Sunak announced an ambitious plan for the whole of the UK, incentivising employment with a job retention bonus scheme and cutting tax for hard-pressed sectors such as hospitality, measures which will directly benefit Scottish workers and business. Far from bypassing devolution, this is devolution working, with the UK Government continuing to inject unprecedented funds directly into the Scottish economy. It is, of course, still not enough for the SNP government, even though yesterday's announcement was warmly welcomed by the FSB, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce and the Scottish Tourism Alliance, to name but a few. Rishi Sunak's cut to stamp duty plainly doesn't apply to Scotland, and while the Cabinet Secretary has just announced a tax break for LBTT up to $250,000, there remains a significant disparity between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So can she explain why she is not committing to a fully equivalent cut for LBTT, and also explain why it cannot be done immediately, given that there will now be a massive incentive to delay and thus cause disruption to the market at that bracket?
Kate Forbes.
Well, rather than talking about the wonderful benefits of the union, for a devolution to work properly, we need adequate funding. And the Tories regularly stand up in this chamber making demands of the Scottish Government to act further, to move further, and to put in place our own economic stimulus. And indeed, Donald Cameron has just done that. But here's the point for the Scottish Tories. You cannot make demands if you deny us both the powers and the funding to do it. Now, the UK Government's announcement yesterday are welcome. I've put on record my welcome of the VAT cut and the wider support for businesses. But there's no getting round it. It does bypass devolution. Now, on to land and buildings transaction tax. The two answers. The first one is that 8 out of 10 buyers in Scotland will be taken out of paying LBTT. As Donald Cameron will know full well, the Scottish housing market is slightly, or rather a lot, different to the rest of the UK. And so tax devolution is about separate tax policies for Scotland, not just about matching those in the rest of the UK. And he will also know full well that the block grant adjustment, which hasn't quite been confirmed by the UK Government, does not allow us to fully replicate decisions that are made elsewhere. In terms of why it cannot be done immediately, that is, we will respond as quickly as we can in the circumstances. I had no advance warning of the intention yesterday to make a change to SDLT. I heard when everybody else did. And having made clear that time is required to prepare legislation and for Revenue Scotland to be ready to collect and manage the tax, we will move quickly. The alternative would have been to say nothing and to create even more uncertainty in the market. So I've chosen to give that clarity, understanding fully the limits on the legislative process and the challenge for Revenue Scotland.
Jackie Bailey.
And I welcome the package of measures from the UK Government, but it can only be viewed as a first step in tackling the economic crisis. When considering the scale of the economic stimulus in France at €15 billion, Germany at €14 billion, then the €3 billion from the UK Government is much, much less than required. So my first question to the Cabinet Secretary is, what proportion of the Scottish budget is she able to set aside to deal with economic recovery? Secondly, can I welcome her announcement about LBTT, but she will be aware that any delay in implementation does cause postponement in house sales and purchases, and that is unhelpful to the housing market. So can she tell us how quickly she will move to put legislation in place? What is that time delay? And lastly, Presiding Officer, let me welcome the £100 million announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance for youth unemployment. But given that she has only received 21 million of consequentials, can she set out for the Chamber where this money is coming from?
Well, in terms of the money that we have set aside on economic recovery, we've already taken the early steps that I indicated in my statement around ensuring that any capital underspend is recycled to ensure it provides jobs. But as she will know, there is significant investment through our budget already. There's £2.3 billion in terms of initial response to businesses. But here's the challenge, and this is why yesterday was an incredibly frustrating day. Because in order to provide additional support, she knows full well that the primary source of additional finance for the Scottish Government is through the UK Government consequentials. And for all the talk of the 800 million, which is warmly welcome, it is largely for PPE and funding announcements that have already been made. In terms of additional resource that are from the economic stimulus package, there is only 21 million. We will use every penny of that to continue to invest in the economy. But until there is additional support, then it will be very difficult to do that without having one hand tied behind our back. Of course, if we had more significant borrowing powers, that would be much easier to do. In terms of how quickly we can move, we will move incredibly fast. It's not a problem with Scottish ministers. We will move quickly. There is a legislative process to go through, and Revenue Scotland need to be ready so that that change can be introduced effectively and efficiently. So we will move very quickly. I cannot put a precise date on it just now, and I don't think that would be particularly helpful in terms of the uncertainty in the market. In terms of youth unemployment, we are aware that we will need to do far more, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, it will next week set out a far more comprehensive and detailed package of policies to support people getting back into work and protecting jobs. And so there will be significant detail included in that. But I agree with her that it will need to be much more, and the challenge will be, as I look across the budget, to make sure we free up any headroom available. There isn't much, but free up any headroom available to have that singular focus on protecting and creating jobs.
Move to the open questions. Can I remind those who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons, please? And I first of all call Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In relation to the measures on hospitality in particular, I'm looking forward to getting back to the pub as much as anybody, but I want to do it when it's safe, and I also want to do it when I know that the people working there are being treated decently. So the announcements from the UK government on this have come in the same week that we've heard that the G1 Group in Glasgow, one of our biggest hospitality employers, is announcing another wave of redundancies. It seems that they're doing that well in advance of the end of the furlough scheme, which could keep those jobs going a bit longer. And the union organisers in Unite Hospitality also tell me that the staff affected have not been consulted with in advance in the way that they're supposed to be, that younger workers who've had less than 2 years service are being particularly targeted because they don't have the same employment rights. And there is a genuine concern that the employer is using furlough money to pay people's wages
please,
in
Mr.
lieu,
Harvey?
which even the UK Treasury wants to rule out. So what can the Scottish Government do to ensure that employers are not abusing the measures that are put in place, that we don't see recovery becoming another race to the bottom on wages and employment standards, and that we actually ensure a sector with endemic problems of poverty pay changes and starts to look after the people who do the work that earn their profits?
Kate Forbes.
Thanks. Well, the first point I'd make is that employers are starting to make decisions about redundancies in part because they know that the furlough scheme is coming to an end and that there is a cliff edge in October. And there was an option for the Chancellor yesterday to extend the furlough scheme, albeit on a sectoral basis, on a phased basis, like France has done for up to 2 years. And that, I think, would mean that avert the rapid increase in redundancies, particularly in the hospitality sector. But the point he makes about ensuring that there are fair work practices in place is important. And I can assure him that all of our support for employability and skills and retraining and support for businesses to keep people in work will have fair work at its heart. As I said, Fiona Hislop will set out the details of that soon, but our assurance is that it will ensure that the individual, particularly young people who are finding themselves in one of the most challenging job markets in a generation, have that support, not just to be in work, but also to have a fair wage and have meaningful contracts.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Yeah, I thank the Finance Secretary for an advance sight of her statement, even if it was titled as from the First Minister. I'm not sure if she had a hand in that. She will hopefully be aware of my colleagues Jamie Stone MP's work to stand up for financial support for the excluded, the self-employed, freelancers and others who have been left behind. In our future discussions with the Chancellor, will she raise this important issue with him, and will she commit her government to support these people too?
Kate Forbes.
The answer is yes. I have already raised those points quite a number of times in particularly my quad calls with with the UK government and also the Welsh and the Northern Irish executive representatives, and I'll continue to do that. And in terms of going forward, we will make sure that funding that we put in place tries to catch everybody. He'll know that in terms of the initial response, we already moved further to ensure, for example, the newly self-employed got support. We can't do that for everybody, but we have moved further where we can. Of course, the two things that are hindering us is access to funding and relaxed fiscal powers. If we had both of those, then we would be able to go even further.
Bruce Crawford, followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, President Officer. Many of us here at Holyrood welcome much of what the Chancellor announced yesterday to protect jobs and the economy. But Cabinet Secretary, would you agree with me that it's equally true to say that what was missing from the announcement that caused great concern? Prior to the announcement, the finance ministers from all three devolved nations very reasonably asked the Chancellor to ease current financial restrictions on devolved governments. which would enable each nation to kickstart their own recoveries. Cabinet Secretary, is it therefore not deeply disappointing that the Tory government has ignored these calls?
Kate Forbes.
It is very disappointing. We made those calls in good faith. We have been reasonable. We've set out the bare minimum of what is required in order to reboot the economy and give us as much flexibility to use our budget effectively. This does not cost the UK government anything, but it would make an enormous difference to Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. We have made those calls for weeks. And I think for all that the Chancellor may have said yesterday about the union, the one thing he could do is actually to make devolution work better by listening to our reasonable calls and acting. This is not about technical powers divorced from reality. This is about us being able to invest in the economy, support communities and protect jobs.
Maurice Golden, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the British Government gave Scotland's tourism and hospitality sector a massive boost by reducing VAT to just 5%. The Chancellor is doing whatever it takes to directly help individuals and businesses in Scotland, unlike the SNP, who are only interested in playing tribal constitutional politics. So, will the Finance Secretary now play her part in helping Scotland by extending the current business rates holiday for as long as is needed?
Kate Forbes.
I didn't hear the end of that.
It was difficult. I found it difficult to hear the end of Mr Golden's question. I would very much like to hear it again. Not the whole thing.
Just the last 3
Just
seconds.
the last bit.
So, will the Finance Secretary now play her part in helping Scotland by extending the current business rates holiday for as long as is needed?
Kate Forbes.
Can I just put on record that I will do whatever it takes? I have said that we will use all of the resources at our disposal. We will use all of the fiscal levers at our disposal to protect jobs and to reboot the economy. The point I am making is that if the Scottish Tories stand up making demands, they must tell me where the funding will come from or give us the powers to do it ourselves. In terms of the non-domestic rates, that is an obvious example of another request that has not come with consequential funding attached. Therefore, whilst I'm very sympathetic to the argument, I'd like to know what part of the budget that money should come from, because we cannot borrow revenue in order to extend those grants, and I cannot recycle money from one part of my budget to the other because of arcane fiscal rules. And so that is the problem here. For all the demands they make, they must give us the powers or the funding to do it.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, UK gross domestic product last year was 2.21 trillion. The Chancellor's economic boost, announced to great fanfare, amounted to barely 1.3% of that, despite the UK economy shrinking by more than 20% in April alone. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the Confederation of British Industry predicting a further 3.5% contraction in the economy next year as a direct result of Brexit? That much more needs to be done, including rebalancing taxes paid by high street retailers with online businesses if our town centres are not to suffer continuing decline and further job losses. Another 5,300 have been announced by Boots and John Lewis only today.
Kate Forbes.
Well, I think that the scale of the economic challenge that we're facing requires an ambitious and practical response. And I think it's highly likely that the Chancellor will most likely have to come back for more. And I think he's delayed a lot of the more significant announcements to the autumn. In terms of the plan yesterday, yes, we know that there has been and will continue to be a contraction in the economy. We know from our own Scottish Government analysis that it's unlikely to be a V-shaped recovery and instead will more likely be a protracted economic recovery. And that's why we need to look not just to the short term but to the long term. We know that a lot of the welcome initiatives that were announced yesterday have a short shelf life. VAT reduction will come to an end in January, the middle of winter, at the hardest point for the tourism industry. We know that the support for wages and jobs will also come to an end in that time period. So the point is, looking further ahead, we need to make sure that there's support in place to support the Scottish economy in particular.
Alex Rowley, followed, I hope, by Emma Harper joining us remotely. Alex Rowley.
It is deeply disappointing, Presiding Officer, that the Chancellor completely ignored the calls from devolved administrations for greater flexibility and for greater borrowing powers. Labour will continue to work with the Scottish Government to push on these issues. The Cabinet Secretary talked specifically about the LBTT and house building and support for new house buyers. Can I say to her that this is an opportunity for us to look at housing on the whole and look at what kind of ambitious housing programme, a national programme for housing that will join all the bits together? And specifically, she'll have seen the calls for Shelter Scotland for an extension of the no eviction policy for people struggling to pay their rent. And will she agree, as part of looking at that we need a national house build programme for Scotland that will bring about real-term, sustainable jobs, training opportunities and apprenticeships? And will she agree to look at bringing forward such a programme and look at housing on the whole rather than parts of?
Kate Forbes.
I think that that's a very helpful offer at the outset for to work with us in terms of the fiscal flexibilities, because, as I said, this has cross-government support, it has cross-party support, and there's a lot of independent think tanks and commentators that have also expressed their support for something that, as I say, doesn't cost the UK government anything, but does support the Scottish economy. In terms of the ambition for housing, the member will know about our ambition to date and our target of 50,000 homes, new homes by the end of this Parliament, and the work that's gone in to investing in new homes. And that kind of ambition, that level of ambition, is something that we want to see continued. In terms of the extension of no eviction policies, again, one of the comments I made in the fiscal pathways was around the national debt plan, and recognising that those who are already in debt are most likely to go after high cost credit, and also most likely to face challenges around things like evictions and otherwise. And as we come through recovery, as we start to ease lockdown, those pressures are not going to disappear. So I think there is a case to be made for how we continue to support and help households with their household finances.
Emma Harper, followed by Alexander Burnett.
To ask the Cabinet Secretary how the announcement from the UK Chancellor, along with support which has already been put in place by the Scottish Government, will assist culture organisations, including those across Dumfries and Galloway, like the Big Burn Supper, the Stranraer Oyster Festival and Kirkcudbright Arts Festivals, and whether she will provide assurances that any money ring-fenced for these organisations will go to this sector.
Kate Forbes.
Again, in the spirit of being positive, let me say how much I welcomed the UK Government's announcement last week of the investment in culture, because it recognises the severe impact of the pandemic on those sectors in particularly. And we hope that the UK Government acts swiftly to share information on how the grants and loans will work, following which we will establish the best means to provide additional support to those devastated by COVID-19. We are, as you would appreciate, continually in discussions with Creative Scotland, and now following the £10 million that we have already made available for performing arts venues, we'll look at how we ensure that that funding gets out the door as quickly as possible to those who need it most.
Alexander Burnett, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I note members to my register of interest. Now, we all welcome business support grants and the Finance Secretary's initial confirmation that the deadline would be the 31st of March 2021. And we were disappointed but understood the change of plan to close the scheme early so that remaining money could be repurposed, as she repeated just now. However, the scheme closes tomorrow and there is no replacement. Businesses, including those in events management and catering who have received nothing so far, would have been waiting to hear the replacement scheme today. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when will she repurpose or provide additional funds for these businesses?
Kate Forbes.
Well, we keep our funding under review at all times. I'm not aware of having promised to replace a new scheme, but we will ensure that funding continues to be made available to businesses that need it most. And as you will already know, parts of that have already been repurposed to ensure that our funding goes even further through the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund and through the hardship scheme, neither of which exist south of the border, and neither of which received consequentials to make it happen. But we will keep that funding under review and hope to continue to work with business organisations to identify those who need the funding the most.
George Adam, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that while the Chancellor's announcement of a £30 billion package of support for jobs is welcome, the UK Government has yet again bypassed devolution, and as a result the Scottish Government will only receive £21 million to support jobs and the economy? Cabinet Secretary, surely this is a missed opportunity to ensure that we have an approach to jobs that is tailored for Scotland's economy.
Kate Forbes.
And the incredible arguments that were being made yesterday about this both being a UK-wide initiative and generating consequentials cannot be true. You cannot have both of those facts existing together. And I hope I laid out in my statement where the different elements come into the overall package. But the overall package, whilst very welcome in parts, particularly the cut in VAT, is a missed opportunity that doesn't give us the funding that we need to tailor our response to Scotland's economy. We will continue to work with industry and will continue to engage with the UK Government in order to ensure that the Scottish Government has the resources that it needs.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Sandra White.
Will the Cabinet Secretary commit to forwarding on all the new consequentials to local government without delay from last week's announcement by Robert Jenrick and the remaining business grants not yet used? And will she act now to give local government financial flexibility and change primary legislation urgently so councils don't have to produce balanced budgets given the crisis, so they can reprofile their deficit given the urgent challenges they face trying to reopen services safely, retain jobs and help support our local economies through investment?
Kate Forbes.
Two brief answers to that. First, yes, we're already working with local government looking at financial flexibilities, and we'll do that. Most of the asks are about legislation that is reserved, but we are closely working, and I speak regularly to Gail McGregor on what those flexibilities would be. In terms of the UK Government's announcement last week, a further £500 million of funding and the scheme to reimburse lost income, we are working with COSLA but also pressing the UK Government to provide urgent further details on how the fiscal flexibilities can be applied for local authorities in Scotland, and as yet do not have the full certainty and transparency on how that will work.
Sandra White, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, there's been a lot of talk about fiscal stimulus and fiscal flexibilities, and I quite understand that. But as others have mentioned, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me, that what is basically needed is transfer of powers to borrow. That is absolutely important. And can the Cabinet Secretary please let it be known that monies which are given, as has been said, from Westminster to Scotland is not monies that is given, it is monies that we pay our taxes towards.
Kate Forbes.
Absolutely. These are not gifts. The Scottish taxpayer pays for it, and the Scottish taxpayer will contribute towards the bill at the end. And in terms of borrowing, again, the UK Government has, and it's welcome, funded most of the interventions through record low interest rate borrowing. We have borrowing powers that are all well and good in normal times, but for an extraordinary crisis like this, they do not work. And these very simple requests we've made about repurposing those borrowing powers would make all the difference to allow us to be flexible in our response and to ensure that hard-pressed households and budgets across the country have the support they need.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I fully support the calls from the Cabinet Secretary for greater flexibility and powers to enable Scottish-specific solutions. We can ask the Cabinet Secretary about potential flexibility that she could look to introduce. First, business in my constituency has received their rates bill, and an increase of 10% is to be applied despite their income currently being down 75%. You have a look at how that system is operating, and what she consider when she looks at the further business support that she alluded to in response to Alexander Burnett, whether some flexibility might be accorded to areas such as Aberdeen, where rateable values are historically high due to historic economic buoyancy, and and thus many businesses of comparable sizes to those elsewhere in Scotland often miss out on support because of their rateable value.
Kate Forbes.
I think two answers in response to that. The first is on rates relief. Of course, the challenges around paying rates is the very reason that we introduce such wide-ranging rates relief. But we've said from the beginning that where a business isn't caught within the criteria for rates relief and feels unable to pay, they should speak to their local authorities in the first instance about what might be able to be done in order to help and support them. In terms of rateable values, of course, a lot of businesses will be getting 100% rates relief right now. Leisure, retail, hospitality and the aviation sectors are all paying no rates at all. But clearly, looking further ahead, beyond the end of this year, we'll take decisions about any extension to that as part of the budget process.
Ruth Maguire, followed by Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. North Ayrshire is at risk of being particularly hard hit by any economic harms. The Ayrshire Growth Deal can be part of the solution to that. It's crucial that it's signed and money is released so that work can begin and the potential benefits to my Ayrshire constituents can be realised. Will the Cabinet Secretary commit to that and urge UK Government counterparts to do the same?
Kate Forbes.
We are very much committed to signing a deal for Ayrshire as soon as possible, and Michael Matheson made that point clear to UK Government colleagues on a call with Ian Stewart, the Minister at the Scotland office last week. So we'll continue to press the UK Government on the matter in order that communities in Ayrshire can start to benefit from a growth deal investment without further delay.
Dean Lockhart, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Finance Secretary, instead of just asking for more money from the UK Government, people want to know how the Scottish Government is using its own budget. For example, the Scottish National Investment Bank has a budget of £500 million, which is coming from financial transactions money from the UK Treasury. Will the Finance Secretary today provide a commitment that all of this budget will be used to save existing viable businesses in Scotland, rather than being wasted on speculative projects of this government, which resulted in a loss of £150 million last year alone?
Kate Forbes.
Tories, instead of asking for more funding, perhaps they could give me the means by which to raise that funding in the first place. Now, we are using all of our budget. We are using every line of our budget to ensure that we are responding to COVID and rebooting the economy. Now, I do not know what speculative projects Dean Lockhart is talking about, but it would be wise for him to consider the fact that the rules right now prohibit me from using money saved from projects that don't go ahead in other parts of the budget. And that is one of the arcane rules, and he has made the point for me as to why those rules need relaxed.
Neil Findlay, followed by Rona Mackay.
I have to say, Presiding Officer, this is a depressing session of this Parliament because people's jobs are at risk now. And if all we get is infantile stuff from the Tories, then this is what we'll see, overseeing jobs go down the tubes with nothing happening on the ground. The Social Market Foundation report last week identified West Lothian is likely to be the worst hit area of the recession that is with us now. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary a very specific question? What targeted support will go to my area of West Lothian to prevent a repeat of the 1980s, where we had unemployment at 23%, and in some council schemes we had youth unemployment at 77%?
Kate Forbes.
Precisely what we want to repeat. We want to prevent a repeat of. We also want to repent. But that is precisely what we want to prevent a repeat of. And in terms of the funding that is being made available today, the policy of that, the detailed policies around that in terms of what will be done to support people will be outlined next week. But as it is, where businesses and organisations have indicated that they are going to go through redundancies, we are willing to step in and provide as much support as possible, because the bottom line is that we want to ensure that people stay in work and that we create new jobs for those that have already been made redundant.
Rona Mackay, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A key principle of fair work is fair pay. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government should be ensuring that young people using the Kickstarter job creation scheme are paid at least the real living wage?
Kate Forbes.
Absolutely, and whilst we welcome support for young people, the UK Government made this announcement without any consultation with the Scottish Government, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy will be writing to the UK Government to express concern on that matter. We're clear that these jobs must be meaningful and allow young people to develop skills that reflect the emerging opportunities, and we need to ensure that our young people are supported to make the best of the opportunities. That has got to have the principles of fair work and payment of the real living wage right at its heart.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. David Phillips, Associate Director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, has said today that the Cabinet Secretary's claim that the Scottish Government will only receive 21 million is not true. So can I ask, is your figure clever political spin? And in the light of your response to Sandra White, can you tell me and confirm if you believe that the total budget that is coming to Scotland this year is less than, equal to, or more than the fiscal framework actually, if the fiscal framework gives you that in relation to the amount of tax that is... Would you like me to repeat it? Okay, that's fine. Do you believe that Scotland gets more money through the fiscal framework than it takes in taxes in Scotland? So do we benefit as a union together?
Kate Forbes.
Well, I think that question perhaps suggests why Michelle Ballantyne missed the detail in my statement, where I made it very, very clear that of the £30 billion of economic stimulus money, only 21 million is coming to the Scottish Government. That figure was reinforced by the Fraser of Allender Institute this morning. I didn't quite follow the rest of her argument or her statement, but the point I would make is that the cost of responding to COVID far outstrips the consequentials that we have received. And unless and until we are given additional powers to raise that money ourselves, I will continue to press the UK Government to provide adequate funding for the response that we need to make.
The last question is to Graham Simpson.
Thank you. The change to the starting rate on LBTT is to be welcomed as far as it goes, but by delaying its implementation, it just means that people won't buy and sell houses until it comes in. So can the Cabinet Secretary at least give an indication of when this change will come in? Will it be this month? Will it be next month? Will it be the month after? Because I think the market needs to know.
Kate Forbes.
Respectfully, I would start by saying, by making the announcement yesterday without any consultation with the Scottish Government, the UK Government has already stalled the housing market in Scotland because people will be waiting for confirmation. And that is why I've provided clarity today and why I've committed to ensuring that both the legislative process and Revenue Scotland can work as quickly as possible to put that in place. And I think that would be better than having introduced even more uncertainty by delaying any announcements. But where tax decisions are made by the UK Government that have an impact on Scotland and where we get no advance notice of that, we have to make do with what we've got.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's response to the Chancellor's summer economic update, and we'll move on to the next item of business.